effort to return to the source and to recover the original freshness of the gospel, new avenues arise, new paths of creativity open up, with different forms of expression, more eloquent signs and words, with new meaning for today's world. I've had the privilege, personally, of serving in a variety of missionary contexts, ad gentes, inter gentes, and intra gentes. And I continue to apply lessons learned from my missionary experiences to the service to which now I have been called. I would like to make a preliminary comment about my sharing with you today. In my presentation, it might appear that I am limiting discussion about Franciscan missionary evangelization only to the dimension of ad gentes. But what I will try to explain to you applies equally for all contexts of missionary evangelization, ad gentes, inter gentes, and intra gentes. The first experience took place when I had to try to learn Swahili in Kenya, and the second in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I served as a missionary for 10 years. The first is related to missionary preparation, a condition sine qua non for engaging in missionary activity, ad gentes, and all other forms of missionary evangelization. The second applies to a situation, a rereading of the gospel text of John chapter 10, verse 10, which I was obliged to undertake thanks to comments of a young Congolese student of law who is now a practicing judge in his country. In 1981, two of us from my province of Sacred Heart in the United States were given the possibility of beginning the missionary journey as students in theology. We devised a program based on the experience of another congregation who was studying with us in Chicago. We left for Paris, where we spent 8 weeks trying to learn French. And after that experience, we flew to Nairobi, Kenya, where we began our language studies, which lasted again for 10 weeks. There we studied Kiswahili, a language spoken by more than 100 million people in Africa. During our stay in Nairobi, not only was I able to study language, but almost immediately found myself, the three of us who were studying language, there was a third friar who joined us later, three of us who studied language, Swahili, we found ourselves involved with street children in Nairobi, the city of Nairobi, with a group called Indugu Society. At the end of the 6-week program, we decided we would go and celebrate our language victories. So we went to an Italian restaurant in the heart of Nairobi. It was a very complex area because in that same area was a red light district for prostitutes. I ordered the food in Swahili and managed to see that the brothers were well fed, so we survived the meal. But at the end of the meal, I wanted to have some tea, hot tea. So I said, Baba, ninataka chai moto katika bikira moto. The table server smiled and then looked over at one of his fellow workers and then politely asked me in Swahili, Nini ninataka? I repeated with great fervor, napenda chai moto katika bikira moto. What I was asking for is I wanted hot water in a thermos, in a hot thermos to have tea. And so the second time he asked, what is it that you want in Swahili? And I responded strongly, I want it now. I want tea, hot tea brought to the table in a thermos. He kept saying each time when I would ask, he said, well, you can't have that here, you have to go outside. I said, why would I have to go outside to have a cup of tea? I said, everyone else is able to have hot tea on their table, why can't I have hot tea here? He says, because we don't do that here. I said, you don't do that here. I said, everyone else is drinking tea, why can't I do it here? Why can't I have tea? Finally, the table waiter asked me in very clear English, "Sir, what exactly do you want?" I said, "I want hot tea in a thermos." At that point, he began to laugh, and two other servers laughed. And the table next to us, where there was a judge, they began to laugh. And the judge turned over and he says, "Sir, do you know that there's a difference between bikira and birika? Two words very close together." I said, "No, what's the difference?" He said, "Well, birika is a thermos that you're asking for. You want a hot thermos." He said, "What you've been asking for is a hot virgin." There are several morals to this funny story. First, Franciscan mission is about our humanity, about our making mistakes, laughing at ourselves and laughing with one another. Franciscan missionary evangelization is about our willingness to enter into a lifelong process of humble learning, listening, and conversion. We must never lose our sense of our gospel minority, of placing ourselves at the service of others, becoming subject to every human creature for God's sake, as we read in the regular Non Volata, subject even to Muslims. A second lesson from this funny story, and that I would only discover later in my Franciscan journey of mission, the preaching of the gospel is about human liberation. It's about bringing glad tidings to the poor, proclaiming liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, letting the oppressed go free, as we hear in Luke's Gospel. It's the promise of the full realization of Shalom, God's reign on earth. Hot water and the red light district of Nairobi gave rise to much thought about what Pope Francis calls the social dimension of evangelization, and which he develops in chapter 4, Evangelii Nuntiandi. I will say more about this presently. The second experience took place in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I served for 10 years, as in a variety of roles. I went to do research for 2 years on the question of social identity and the role religion plays in constructing social identity in a small town 150 kilometers west of the capital city of Kinshasa. While there, I used to go, during the weekdays, I stayed with a family in their neighborhood, in their house, to try to understand and enter into the culture. On weekends, I would go to a mission parish, Sacred Heart, run by the Redemptorist priests and brothers. And there, I would help with one or the other of the masses on the weekend. One Sunday, the gospel text from John 10:10 was presented, proclaimed the gospel, where Jesus speaks about the promise to his disciples and those who believe in him, that they would have life and have it in abundance. I no longer remember what I said in the sermon, but I do remember the challenge of one of the young university students who spoke to me after the Mass. Mon Père, vous nous avez parlé du message de Jésus sur la vie et l'abondance. Je crois en Dieu, en Jésus, et aussi toute ma famille. Et nous n'avons pas encore goûté cette abondance promise. Pourquoi? Father, you spoke very eloquently about John 10:10. You told us about Jesus' promise of life and abundance. I believe in God. My family believes in God and Jesus. But why have we not yet tasted of the abundance that God has promised? Why? In subsequent discussions with Roger, who has become and remains a close friend, he continues to talk about the challenges in his life as a father, a judge, a Christian and Congolese living in a situation where some people would describe it as a living hell. He continues to seek out the meaning of the words of Jesus, to see these applied to his life, to the life of his family, and to the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo, who live in a permanent state of insecurity, injustice, and yet who remain open to the good news, who seek to live out their Christian identity as believers, co-disciples, and co-missionaries. As Pope Francis reminds us in his apostolic exhortation, paragraph 16, Christian mission does not have all the capacity to provide answers to all of the different and complex problems that arise in today's world. 21 years later, Roger and I continue our dialogue about the meaning of the gospel text of John 10:10. He continues to challenge my understanding of faith, of social systems, of justice and peace as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel. I have never sought to provide a simple or pietistic response to his questions, because I recognize that his question arises from deep within humanity. It is a question that all human beings carry in their hearts everywhere, especially the poor and marginalized, immigrants and displaced people, and those who live in inhuman and unjust conditions. Franciscan missionary evangelization requires that we enter into the paschal mystery of Jesus, a paschal mystery continuing to be played out in the drama and the crises of humanity. In such situations, the most immediate response is to embrace the crucified, as did Francis, and to allow the Spirit to lead us into the desert, into a place of contemplation and prayer. We are not called to solve the world's problems through missionary evangelization. We are called to bear them in our hearts and our hands, bringing them before the altar of the Most High God, placing them into God's tender and merciful hands. Only by doing this, and by engaging with all of our energy in the care of God's people and of creation, will we be able to slowly see realized in our midst God's plan for total restoration of all to a state of shalom. Franciscan missionary evangelization is not about giving answers to what troubles humanity in its marrow. Rather, it is about making ourselves available, remaining not only in Jesus grafted to the vine, as John chapter 15 tells us, but also remaining in one with God's people, refusing to run away from violence, injustice, desperation, grief, and all forms of confusion. As our general constitutions remind us, in order that they may follow more closely and express more clearly the self-emptying of the Savior, the friars are to have the life and condition of the little ones in society, always living among them as minors. By their way of life, as a fraternity and as individuals, the friars are to behave in such a way that no one is kept from them, particularly those who usually are socially and spiritually neglected. My experience with the man who I now call John 10:10, Rocher, reveals yet another dimension of Christian and Franciscan missionary evangelization. Contrary to past and current conceptions and practices of Christian and Franciscan mission, the mandate of Jesus to preach the good news is not about sending individual missionaries isolated from others, and who in many ways, if not most cases, proceed to erect kingdoms not of God's making, but of their own. One of the greatest challenges to Franciscan mission and evangelization and to the order remains that of friars who, whether living in fraternity or not, go about the task of formation as if they were the only persons who mattered. Mission is not about going to distant frontiers and erecting golden calves before which the local populations are expected to bow down in gratitude and worship. In far too many cases in the past and present, lone Christian and Franciscan missionaries have conducted their projects in a personal way among any given people, without submitting these to the collective wisdom of the fraternity and even in some cases without asking the local people, what really do you need? In addition to acting independent of the fraternity, many of these lone choirs also have engaged in a type of missionary activity that treats people as if they were morally, spiritually, intellectually, culturally, and in all other ways deficient or infirm. How many times have Franciscan religious and lay missionaries perverted the radical and liberating experience of authentic Franciscan missionary evangelization, reducing the people to a state of passive, receptive subjects who are not yet capable or able to do what is theirs to do, to be active co-disciples and co-missionaries, carrying within their communities, the explosive joy of the gospel. The entire Christian missionary project, and in even more intense manner, the Franciscan missionary endeavor, is not about doing things alone. It is about discovering the power and joy of going out 2 or 3 or more together, sharing with others what we ourselves are experiencing, and namely an intense experience of the love and mercy of God lived within the fraternity, the community, the family, in case of lay missionaries, and only then going out and daring to speak to others about what we ourselves are receiving and sharing together. As Pope Francis reminds us in Evangelii Gaudium, the church which goes forth is a community of missionary disciples who take the first step, who are involved and supportive, who bear fruit and rejoice. For the church, it is the Christian community that is missionary. For us Franciscans, it is the fraternity that is the nucleus from which all missionary activity is born, through which it is actively conducted, and by which it is evaluated and continually reformed, in order that our missionary efforts might continually be renewed in the freshness of the gospel, providing new avenues, new paths of creativity, different forms of expression, more eloquent signs and words with new meaning for today's world. Evangelization has been at the heart of the church's identity from its very beginning. Many different experiences and models of missionary evangelization have been developed, implemented, and later discarded in order to make way with each new generation for the creation of new forms of understanding, integration, and communicating the good news of Jesus, inviting people to become members of the living body of Christ, the church. At the same time, the evangelizing and missionary efforts of the church have had to take stock of changing contexts, both as the church expanded its presence to new, unfamiliar cultural, linguistic, geographical, religious, and philosophical settings, becoming a global or world church, as Karl Rahner once said, and also as the church attempted to respond to changes within those regions where Christianity was already deeply implanted in the culture. In the case of the latter, where Christianity has been deeply planted, we have only to examine the recent experience of globalization, secularization, and multicultural and multi-religious societies, and the challenges and opportunities for the church and for the order that they provide and provoke. Parenthetically, I want to insist once again on the fact that the contexts of missionary evangelization ad gentes, inter gentes, and inter gentes can no longer be understood as completely separated, one from the other, because of the impact of globalization, with the major movements of peoples worldwide. In this context, the mission of God that is entrusted to the church today becomes once again what it was at the beginning, namely one, unified. In each of these missionary moments or changing contexts, the church also benefited from the experiences arising from its missionary evangelizing activities, enabling the church and even the order to deepen its understanding of God, of Jesus, the Spirit at work in the church, in the order, in the world, and to embrace new forms and expressions capable of transmitting the essential message of the gospel and the church in new context. Study, research, ongoing formation are critical tools for the realization of the mandate for missionary evangelization within the church, and also within the Franciscan order movement today. Today, this is made evident in the study centers of the order, most especially in the missionary training programs in Brussels, Petropolis, Manila, and also the lay missionary centers in such places as Washington, D.C. I want to insist here again, for far too long, the practice of mission has excluded the dimension of ongoing formation and reform of our missionary understanding, our missionary vision. We can no longer afford to do this. Formation is an integral part of the missionary experience. What I have described with regards to the history of Christian mission in the church applies equally to the history of missionary evangelization within our order. The Franciscan movement and the Order of Friars Minor in particular have taken seriously the missionary mandate of the church since the time of Francis of Assisi and his first followers. However, the early friars developed a particular understanding and practice of missionary evangelization that continues to challenge even as it inspires and shapes our contemporary practice of mission. According to recent scholarship, the preaching model employed by Francis and his early brothers emphasized the primacy of witness to an authentic human and Christian life as a starting point for all missionary evangelization. You will hear more about this in the program these days. In chapter 14 of the Regula Nobulata, there is a description of a brotherhood that met and engaged people in the course of their journey about the world, embodying peace in their relationships. And through example of life and work, they pointed out the nearness of God's kingdom without any exercise of power or authority. Thus, a second key theme, or another theme of message in the practice of Franciscan evangelizing mission, is nothing more nor less than the promise of peace that God's kingdom provides for those of us who take seriously the gospel. Francis inserted into his Propositum Vitae God's blessing of peace, Shalom. May the Lord give you peace, which forms part of the missionary mandate of the 72 disciples who were dispatched 2 by 2 to proclaim what they themselves had received and to offer peace to all of the world's inhabitants, as we read in the Regula Nobulata and the Testament. The message and practice of missionary evangelization for Francis was grounded in his personal experience and the relationship that each of the brothers had with the Lord Jesus, that they shared with one another in fraternity, and that they carried to the world as a message of wholeness, blessedness, and peace. The preaching of peace was not an addition to or non-essential element of the evangelical life and preaching of the early friars. It was at the heart of their message. Today, more than ever, our Franciscan witness to peace and reconciliation in our prayer, our fraternities, and all of our activities of missionary evangelization is urgently needed. People still believe that Franciscans are instruments for peace and reconciliation in the world. The question is, do we believe this? For Francis, the evangelizing methods and preaching of Francis and the early brothers was grounded in the doing of penance. According to Michael Posado, a Franciscan scholar, Francis understood penance as an action, a verb, not a noun. Penance was for him to be understood as the conversion process of one's sin into the sacramental moment and then beyond into the flow of one's daily life, to be the way that one lived one's entire life. Penance was, in one's way, the life of Christ, to become like Christ. In the life